What did happen was the Idaho State Supreme Court, they basically issued an order saying they were going to cancel all court proceedings unless they were like emergency or really had to get done. And that does extend to evictions.
Hi, I'm Scott Eadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. And it certainly is unique, as we are all well aware by now. And joining us today to talk about some of the things going on in the inland Northwest and beyond is correspondent Nick Deshaies. Thanks for joining us today, Nick.
Thanks, Scott. I'm glad to be here, sitting at home, working from home, as are you.
I am, but I would like if the regular studio in Pullman actually had the Croatian flag. That would be great. And I think my Croatian side of the family would love to be represented, but that is neither here nor there. So let's dive right into some of the things of late that you've been reporting on. And a big one is actually the 1918 flu pandemic 102 years ago and how it affected the inland Northwest and more specifically Spokane and some of the lessons that were learned. Tell us what happened in 1918.
So in short, 1918, for those who aren't familiar with American history or world history, was the end of World War I. The first the Great War, they called it, the war to end all wars. And an influenza, they think, broke out somewhere in Europe. They're still not sure what happened, but when all the soldiers went home, they all took the flu with them. And so a huge pandemic came to the world, including the inland Northwest. I decided to look into it just because we're experiencing a pandemic again, and in nobody's living memory can we remember the last time this happened, because it was 102 years ago in 1918, the last time a major pandemic came. So I thought I'd look at it and see how people dealt with it then, what sort of measures were put in place, what the death toll, the infection toll is like, and kind of compare it to what's happening now with coronavirus. Of course, we don't know what's happening with coronavirus in terms of how bad it'll be or how not bad it hopefully will be. But I thought it'd be a good time to look at that. So just real quickly on the 1918 flu. It came, and I focused on Spokane because I went into the Spokesman Review and Spokane Daily Chronicle archives. They did a pretty good job day to day, twice a day, because there's a morning paper and an afternoon paper, kind of relating what was happening. And in Spokane, it's pretty striking. It was very similar to what's happening now. There was a public health officer in the city and in the statewide. Once Spokane had its first confirmed case, schools were canceled. There was basically a stay-home order. They didn't call it that then. Restaurants were closed. So it was kind of a public quarantine, similar to what we're going through now, this kind of isolation we're going through now. Back then, it lasted about 3 months. So we're not sure how long what we're going through will last, but if past is any indication, which it shouldn't be because it was a pretty different pandemic, we could be looking at 3 months of staying inside.
Okay, and let's talk about some of those lessons that were learned and relay them to what people are doing today in terms of public health responses. Some of the things that the public health officer in Spokane did back then are mirrors of today. And are there any lessons learned that the current public health officials in the region have taken away from what happened over 100 years ago?
Sure. Yeah. The big one is social isolation, social distancing. They told people to stay at home and not come out. And it was hard back then because the war was ending. People wanted to celebrate. People wanted to see their loved ones return from Europe. And the public health officer said, you can't have these celebrations. You can't come together in big groups of people. It's too dangerous. Also, it was happening around the holidays. And so he, about a month into that pandemic, he thought it was getting better. John Anderson was his name, Dr. John Anderson, the public health officer. So he allowed people to have Thanksgiving celebrations. They celebrated Thanksgiving, and then the flu came back. It resurged, and so he canceled all Christmas and New Year's celebrations too. So what we're seeing now, where we're being told not to go out at all unless it's for essential services. Not that long ago, we were told not to be in groups of larger than 10 people. That's all stuff we learned from the 1918 pandemic, and even before then, during the bubonic plague, they were doing these social isolation techniques as well. So it's not that it's a new thing what we're trying now. It's very old. What's new now, and especially since 1918, is we didn't even know what a virus was back then. We didn't have a vaccine. Vaccines for anything had yet to be invented. And so we have science on our side now, but the measures that are being put in place are kind of tried and true. And, back then it was a little more trying to think of the right word, but Dr. John Anderson, I used the word belligerent in the piece. He was, he didn't suffer fools. He threatened to arrest the mayor because the mayor said he was going to throw a party. So he was kind of bringing the hammer down. Today, we haven't seen those threats really, though we're hearing more and more from the governor of Washington, Jay Inslee, that he's not going to send the troops out or anything like that, but he's just saying everybody has to follow these orders, and he's not threatening us he's going to do it, but you can kind of feel that it might be coming, that we'll be told that we'll be fined if we're throwing a party, or if we're in a group of 50 people doing something we shouldn't be doing.
Well, speaking of Governor Jay Inslee, let's get into some of the policies and orders that he has enacted and compare and contrast them to the orders of the neighboring states, specifically Idaho. You're in a unique position in that you cover both of those areas from an inland Northwest perspective, and you kind of straddle the border almost literally. So I just wonder, can we talk a little bit about some of those differences and similarities between what has happened in Idaho and Washington, and how the governors have enacted those policies and on what timelines?
Well, they're two very different states. As people who live in Washington and Idaho know, Washington is, to use the terminology of today, a blue state, and Idaho is a red state. We have a Republican governor of Idaho and a Democratic governor of Washington. And so I think that kind of lays the foundation for how they're reacting. But more importantly, I believe, is Washington, as most people know, had the first confirmed case in the nation and also the first death from COVID in the nation. And so Washington State was ahead of the curve in that sense. So it all came to Washington first. And so the first orders, as far as closing schools, telling restaurants to close their dining rooms, issuing a stay-at-home order, all of that happened first in Washington, and then later came to Idaho. The thing that kind of shows the big difference in the state, and it kind of makes me laugh a little bit, is the list of essential businesses between the two. They're very similar. You have, healthcare workers have to go to work, gas stations have to stay open, grocery stores have to stay open in both states. But there are some minor differences. In Idaho, gun stores remain open. Washington, those have been closed. And here in Washington, places like bicycle mechanics remain open. Retail cannabis stores, which don't even exist in Idaho, those remain open here. So those are some pretty interesting differences between the two. Beyond that, schools have been shut down. State parks have largely been shut down in both of those cases. Another small difference is golf courses in Washington State have all been closed. In Idaho, golf courses remain open. So there's these little fringe differences between the two. But by and large, both governors, both Jay Inslee and Brett Little, have said, please don't go outside, or please don't go to places where people are congregating, and please don't gather in large groups of people. Just stay at home and be safe.
Real quickly, though, one difference, though, again, that is pretty stark, is the differences in eviction policies, right? Because people were very worried about, rent coming due around the first of the month. And there's some differences there that seem to be sort of interesting and intriguing that you reported on. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. That's a major difference, I'd say. In Washington State, they've put a moratorium on evictions for people who are past due in rent, who can't pay rent because of the coronavirus thing everybody's going through. Attorney General Bob Ferguson and the governor have both spoken pretty strongly in saying, do not kick people out. We already have a homeless problem in our state and in our nation. Don't make it worse when people are losing their jobs from this. In Idaho, the governor has not issued such a proclamation. From what I've heard, he explored it and decided, or was told, he probably couldn't do it because of the Constitution. So he threw it to the legislature, and the legislature didn't act on it. What did happen was the Idaho State Supreme Court, they basically issued an order saying they were going to cancel all court proceedings unless they were like emergency or really had to get done. And that does extend to evictions. Now, if somebody's getting evicted because of illegal drug trafficking or production, they can still be evicted. But when it comes to these run-of-the-mill, somebody's behind on rent, they won't get kicked out of their house. That's from what I understand. Now, it's a kind of a complex issue. Nobody from the governor's office or from the legislature would respond to me, and even the state Supreme Court kind of pushed it off. But talking to housing advocates and tenants' rights groups, that's what's happening in Idaho.
A few weeks ago, I never would have caught myself saying, gosh, I wish we could talk more about election news and election stories because I want more of that. But now it's sort of interesting that the roles are kind of reversed, and there's other stuff to talk about. And there is a big election this year, not just for president, but of course in state houses and for every seat in the U.S. House of Representatives and other things like that. And so let's talk a little bit about that going forward over the next few months, and especially from an inland Northwest perspective. What are some of the issues and races that you're going to be keeping your eye on as we move forward into spring and summer and into the fall for the election?
Yeah, well, like you mentioned, the big one is the Congress race in the 5th District here. Representative Cathy McMorris Rodgers is up for re-election, as every congressperson is every 2 years. And usually by this time, there's a candidate, a prominent candidate that's, started the race and started to campaign against her. Last cycle, it was Lisa Brown, former Senate Majority Leader. She now leads the Department of Commerce at the state. She ran a pretty strong race, ended up losing by about 10 points. But she was already running pretty hard by this time in the race. Now we don't really have anybody. We have a gentleman named Chris Armitage. He's a young man. I think he may just be the only one that stands up against her to try to unseat her. But she's proven pretty popular in this part of the state, and so I think it would be hard to unseat her. But that's the big race we're all paying attention to here. Aside from the presidential race, of course, which, as you mentioned, was kind of sucking all the oxygen out of the media room for about a year, and now you don't really hear about it in face of coronavirus.
No, certainly not, but we don't want to forget about things. Of course, there are lots of issues that we want to pay attention to. I'll take this quick opportunity to plug NWPB's election year coverage. It's at nwpb.org/vote2020. And while there, you can listen to or subscribe to our election year podcast called How We Ended Up Here. And of course, as we go forward in this year, we're going to be talking more about coronavirus and how we ended up here in relation to elected officials and the public health response. Nick Deshay, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great talking with you.
Thanks, Scott. Great to be here. Nice to see you.
You can see more of Nick's reporting on these and other topics at nwpb.org. Thank you for joining us here in the Unique Northwest.